I overheard my father tell his commanding officer that I had a breakdown during deployment and gave up after 3 years. The truth? I had never had a breakdown, and I was currently in my 8th year of active classified service. The Fort Richardson Officers Club had never looked more elegant. Red, white, and blue bunting draped the walls, and a massive American flag served as the backdrop for the stage where my father would deliver his retirement speech. 300 guests filled the room: generals, colonels, senators, and family members who had traveled from across the country to honor Colonel James Hart's 30-year military career. I sat in the third row, smoothing my navy blue dress, civilian clothes that felt appropriate for what I thought would be a celebration of my father's service. My mother Susan sat beside me, radiant in her role as the perfect military wife, while my brother Marcus looked sharp in his army dress uniform, his captain's bars gleaming under the chandeliers. The ceremony began with military precision. General Morrison, my father's former commanding officer, took the stage first. Ladies and gentlemen, today we honor a man who has dedicated his life to protecting our nation. Colonel James Hart has served with distinction in 3 combat zones, led thousands of soldiers, and built a legacy that will endure for generations. Hey beautiful soul! Before we dive in, show some love with a like, tap subscribe, and tell me, where in this big beautiful world are you watching from? When my father finally approached the podium, the room erupted in applause. At 58, he still carried himself with the bearing of a career soldier, shoulders back, chin up, every gesture deliberate and commanding. He began his speech with the standard gratitude to his commanding officers, his fellow soldiers, and his family's sacrifice during his deployments. Then he shifted to talking about legacy. A military career isn't just about the individual serving, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. It's about the values we pass down, the traditions we uphold, and the next generation we inspire to serve. He paused, looking directly at my brother. My son Marcus has made me incredibly proud. He's a fine officer following in my footsteps, currently serving with the 82nd Airborne Division. He understands what it means to be a Hart in uniform. The pride in his voice was unmistakable. Marcus straightened in his seat, beaming under the public recognition. I felt genuinely happy for my brother. He deserved that moment. But then my father's tone changed. His voice became more measured, almost apologetic. My daughter Evelyn also tried military service for a time. The word tried hit me like a physical blow. She left the military after a few years and has struggled to find her place in the civilian world. Not everyone is cut out for service, and that's okay. We can't all be soldiers. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. I felt hundreds of eyes turning toward me, and I could practically hear the whispered conversations that would follow. Poor thing, couldn't handle military life. Must have been hard on the family. At least their son turned out well. My chest tightened as I sat there in my civilian dress, watching my father publicly erase 8 years of my life. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that I hadn't left the military at all. I had been serving at the highest levels of military intelligence for the past 8 years, but my work was so classified that even my own family couldn't be told. To maintain operational security, I had let them believe I was a civilian. While my father continued his speech, praising the military values that had shaped our family, I realized the devastating irony. I was sitting in that audience as a lieutenant colonel in special operations, holding a top-secret clearance, having completed more dangerous missions than he had ever imagined. But to him, to everyone in that room, I was just his daughter who couldn't hack it in the military. As applause filled the room for his closing remarks, I sat frozen, understanding for the first time just how completely my father had rewritten my story. The reception hall buzzed with the typical post-ceremony energy, officers sharing war stories, families catching up, and the gentle clink of champagne glasses. I moved through the crowd with practiced grace, but I could feel the weight of every interaction before it even began. Colonel Rodriguez, one of my father's longtime friends, approached me first. His wife Martha was by his side, both wearing expressions of carefully composed sympathy. "Evelyn, dear," Martha said, reaching for my hand, "I'm so sorry to hear about your struggles since leaving the military. Your father mentioned you've been having a hard time finding your footing in civilian life." I forced a smile, feeling my jaw tighten. "Thank you for your concern, but I'm doing well." Colonel Rodriguez nodded knowingly. Transition can be tough. Not everyone is built for long-term military service. There's no shame in discovering it wasn't the right fit. His tone was kind but patronizing, like he was comforting a child who had failed a test. Before I could respond, they had moved on, leaving me standing there with the sting of their pity. But it was just the beginning. Major General Patricia Wells, a woman I had actually briefed on classified operations just 6 months earlier, approached next. Of course she couldn't know that. "Evelyn, I remember when you were just starting out as a young lieutenant. Such promise. It's unfortunate things didn't work out for you in the service." The irony was suffocating. Here was a woman I currently outranked, offering me consolation for a career failure that never happened. I nodded politely, saying nothing that might compromise operational security. Throughout the evening it continued. "Your father says you're trying to find yourself in the civilian world. Must be difficult not living up to the family tradition. At least Marcus is carrying on the Hart military legacy." The worst part was watching my family's reactions. My father worked the room like a politician, and every time someone mentioned me, he would put on this expression of resigned disappointment. "Yes, well, Evelyn gave it her best shot, but military life isn't for everyone. We're proud of her for trying." My mother stood beside him like a loyal lieutenant, nodding at every word. When Mrs. Henderson, the wife of my father's former commander, asked her directly about my current work, my mother actually said, "She's still figuring things out. You know how it is with some young people these days." I caught my brother Marcus watching these interactions with growing discomfort. He knew something wasn't right. He had seen me in Washington, D.C. wearing business suits, carrying myself with confidence, clearly employed in some capacity. But he had never questioned the family narrative directly. The breaking point came when my father introduced me to a group of his former colleagues. "Gentlemen, this is my daughter Evelyn. She tried the military route for a few years but found her calling elsewhere." The phrase "found her calling elsewhere" was his diplomatic way of saying I had failed without using the word directly. One of the men, a gruff old colonel, looked me up and down. He hadn't just failed to understand my career. He had actively constructed a false narrative about my life and shared it with hundreds of people over the years. While I had been serving my country in the most demanding ways possible, he had been telling everyone I was a disappointment who couldn't measure up to the Hart family standards. I excused myself to the bathroom not to cry, but to process the magnitude of the lie I was living inside. Standing in that bathroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror, I was transported back to 8 years ago. I was 24, a fresh-faced second lieutenant with fire in my eyes and something to prove. My father had just been promoted to colonel, and the whole family had gathered at Fort Bragg to celebrate. That night, over dinner at the officers' club, I had made the mistake of sharing my career aspirations with him. "Dad, I've been thinking about applying for special operations. My commanding officer thinks I have the aptitude for intelligence work." The fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully, the way he did when he was about to deliver what he considered fatherly wisdom. "Evelyn, sweetheart, let's be realistic here. You're smart, I'll give you that, but special operations? That's not exactly appropriate for women." My mother had immediately jumped in with her usual peacekeeping role. "Your father just wants what's best for you, honey. There are so many wonderful opportunities in the military that would be perfect for a young woman with your talents." "Like what?" I had asked, genuinely curious about what they thought I was suited for. "Administration," my father said without hesitation. "You're organized, detail-oriented. Or maybe military intelligence, the analytical side, not the field work. Something safe, something that plays to your natural strengths." I felt my temper flare. "And what exactly are my natural strengths, Dad?" He had leaned back in his chair, adopting that patronizing tone I knew so well. "You're nurturing, you're good with people, you're methodical. These are wonderful qualities, but they're not the qualities needed for special operations. That kind of work requires physical strength, mental toughness, the ability to make life or death decisions under extreme pressure. And you don't think I have those qualities? I think you're my daughter, and I've watched you your whole life. You cried when you had to put down your childhood dog. You get emotionally invested in people. You're too soft for that kind of work, Evelyn, and there's nothing wrong with that." The words had stung then, but what happened next was worse. Over the following weeks, I discovered that my father had been making phone calls. He had reached out to his contacts in personnel, subtly steering opportunities away from me. When I applied for a transfer to military intelligence, my application was mysteriously delayed. When I expressed interest in specialized training programs, I was told they were full or not appropriate for officers of my experience level. It was Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez who finally told me the truth. She pulled me aside after a training exercise and said, "Evelyn, I need to ask you something directly. Are you serious about special operations? Or are you just exploring options?" "I'm dead serious, ma'am." "Why?" She looked uncomfortable. "Because I've had 3 different people tell me that you're not really interested in field work, and that your family would prefer you stay in more traditional roles. I wanted to hear it from you directly." That's when I realized what my father had done. He hadn't just dismissed my ambitions, he had actively sabotaged them. He was using his rank and connections to protect me from what he saw as dangerous choices, but in doing so, he was limiting my entire future. That night, I called General Patricia Coleman, who had been recruiting for a classified intelligence unit. She had approached me months earlier, but I had been waiting for the right time to make my move. When I told her about my father's interference, she was quiet for a long moment. "Lieutenant Hart," she finally said, "if you're serious about serving your country at the highest levels, you need to understand something. This work requires compartmentalization. That means your family, your friends, even your fellow officers won't know what you're doing. Can you handle that?" I thought about my father's phone calls, his dismissive comments, his certainty that he knew what was best for me. "Yes, ma'am. I can handle that." "Good. Because if you join my unit, your official military record will show a transfer to administrative duties. Your family will think you've taken a safe, boring job. Are you prepared for that misunderstanding?" I was. What I wasn't prepared for was how completely my father would rewrite my story once I disappeared from his view. Walking back into that reception hall, I began to see the full architecture of the lie my father had constructed. It wasn't just that he had misunderstood my career path. He had actively built an entire false narrative and shared it with everyone who mattered in his world. I positioned myself near the bar, close enough to overhear conversations but far enough away to remain unnoticed. What I heard made my blood run cold. Colonel Thompson, my father's former deputy, was talking to a group of younger officers. "It's really too bad about James's daughter. Such a bright girl, but she just couldn't handle the pressure. He told me she had some kind of breakdown during her first deployment." Breakdown? I had never had a breakdown. I had never even had a difficult deployment in the traditional sense because my work was entirely different. Another voice chimed in. "I heard she was having trouble with authority figures. James said she clashed with her commanding officers and couldn't follow orders." This was getting worse. Not only had my father invented a failure, he had invented character flaws to explain it. I moved closer to another group. "The Hart boy is solid though," someone was saying. "James always said Marcus got the military genes. Poor Evelyn just wasn't cut out for it. Too emotional, too soft. James said she used to call home crying after training exercises." I felt my hands clench into fists. I had never called home crying. I had barely called home at all during my training because I was too busy excelling at every challenge they threw at me. But the worst revelation came when I overheard my father talking to General Morrison, his former commanding officer. "I tried to guide her toward more suitable roles," my father was saying. "Administrative work, maybe personnel management." But she was stubborn, wanted to prove something. When reality hit, she couldn't handle it. "How long did she last?" General Morrison asked. "About 3 years. I think she realized she was in over her head and just gave up. She's been struggling ever since. Susan and I have been trying to help her find her way, but you know how it is with kids these days. They don't always appreciate guidance." 3 years. He had compressed my entire 8-year classified career into 3 years of failure. In his version, I hadn't just left the military, I had been defeated by it. I continued listening, moving through the crowd like a ghost at my own funeral. The story was remarkably consistent, which meant my father had been telling it for years, refining it, adding details that made it more believable. He had turned my necessary silence about classified work into proof of shame and failure. The most heartbreaking moment came when I heard my mother talking to her book club friends. "We're just so worried about her," she was saying. "She won't talk about her time in the service. I think she's embarrassed about how things ended. James says she's probably dealing with some kind of trauma from not being able to keep up with the demands." Trauma from not being able to keep up. The reality was that I had excelled beyond anything my father had ever achieved, but his narrative had transformed my success into psychological damage. Standing there, surrounded by people who respected and believed my father's version of events, I finally understood the full scope of what he had done. He hadn't just failed to understand my career, he had systematically destroyed my reputation in the military community while I was serving it with distinction. I finished my drink, set the glass down with deliberate care, and made my way to my father. He was holding court with a group of retired officers, gesturing expansively as he told some story about his early days in the service. When he saw me approaching, his expression shifted to that practiced look of paternal concern. "Evelyn, sweetheart, are you enjoying yourself? I know these military gatherings can be a bit overwhelming for civilians." The word civilians hung in the air between us. I looked directly into his eyes and smiled the kind of smile I had perfected during years of high-stakes negotiations. "It's been very enlightening, Dad. Thank you for the invitation." "Of course, honey. Family is family." I nodded once, turned to the group of officers and said, "Gentlemen, congratulations on my father's retirement. I hope you all have a wonderful evening." Then I walked away without another word. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't try to correct the record or hint at the truth. I simply extracted myself from the situation with the same precision I used in classified operations. At the coat check, my mother caught up with me. "Evelyn, you're not leaving already, are you? The evening is just getting started." "I have an early morning, Mom. Work commitments." "Oh." She looked confused, probably because in her mind, I didn't have the kind of work that required early mornings or serious commitments. "Well, maybe we can have lunch next week? I feel like we haven't talked in so long. I'll check my schedule and get back to you." My brother Marcus intercepted me at the door. "Ev, wait up." He looked genuinely troubled. "Something's not right here. I mean, I know you can't talk about your work, but the way Dad talks about you, it doesn't match what I see when we get together." This was the closest anyone in my family had come to questioning the official narrative. For a moment, I considered telling him everything. But operational security wasn't just about protecting classified information. It was about protecting the people who might accidentally compromise it. "Marcus, I appreciate your concern, but I'm fine. Really. But Dad said you had problems in the service, that you couldn't handle it. That doesn't sound like the sister I know." I put my hand on his shoulder. Sometimes people see what they expect to see, not what's actually there. Dad has his version of events, and I have mine. He studied my face, clearly wanting to press further, but I had already started walking toward the exit. Over the next few weeks, I declined every family invitation. When my mother called asking why I missed Marcus's promotion ceremony, I simply said I had a work conflict. When she invited me to Sunday dinner, I was traveling for business. When my father called to check in, something he had never done before, I kept the conversation brief and professional. I wasn't avoiding them out of anger or hurt feelings. I was creating distance while I figured out my next move. Every time I stayed away, they interpreted it as more evidence of my supposed struggles. My mother started leaving concerned voicemails. My father began mentioning to his friends that I was going through a difficult time and pulling away from family. They were writing the script for their own narrative. I was just letting them. 3 days after the retirement ceremony, I sat in my secure office at the Pentagon, staring at a blank legal pad. For 8 years, I had protected my family's feelings by allowing them to believe a lie. Now I needed to protect my own reputation by documenting the truth. I started with what I could legally obtain. My first call was to Personnel Records Management. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Hart. I need certified copies of my complete service record, minus any classified annotations." "Of course, ma'am. What time frame are you looking for?" "Everything from my commissioning date to present." The stack of documents that arrived a week later was 3 inches thick. Service dates, duty assignments, performance evaluations, promotion recommendations, awards and commendations. 8 years of evidence that I had never left the military, never failed, never had a breakdown. My fitness reports were particularly telling. Exceptional officer with unlimited potential. Recommended for immediate promotion and increased responsibility. Performs at levels far exceeding her current rank. These weren't the evaluations of someone who had washed out or couldn't handle military life. Next, I reached out to former colleagues who could speak to my character without violating security protocols. Colonel Janet Morrison from the War College wrote a letter of recommendation that began, "In 15 years of military service, I have rarely encountered an officer of Lieutenant Colonel Hart's caliber and dedication. Captain David Chun, my current supervisor, was more direct when I explained the situation. Your father told people you had a breakdown? Ma'am, with all due respect, that's complete garbage. You're one of the most mentally tough officers I've ever worked with." But the most powerful evidence came from an unexpected source. I discovered that my security clearance renewals were public record. Not the details of my work, but the fact that I maintained top secret clearance. Someone who had failed in the military and left in disgrace wouldn't be renewed for high-level security clearance every 2 years. I also gathered more personal evidence. Bank records showing direct deposit from the Department of Defense for 8 consecutive years. Tax documents listing my employer as the U.S. Army. Even my apartment lease application from 3 years ago listed my occupation as military officer and my employer as Department of Defense. The smoking gun came when I reached out to family friends who had questioned the inconsistencies. Mrs. Patricia Williams, my mother's college roommate, had been wondering about the discrepancies for years. "Evelyn, honey, I've been meaning to ask," she said when I called her. "Your mother always talks about how you're struggling to find yourself after leaving the military, but last year at the church fundraiser, I distinctly remember you mentioning you had to cut the evening short because you were deploying to Germany the next week. Civilians don't deploy to Germany." She had been paying attention when my own family wasn't. Colonel Sarah Martinez, who had originally warned me about my father's interference, agreed to provide a sworn statement about his attempts to limit my career opportunities 8 years earlier. "He actively worked against your professional interests," she wrote. "His actions were inappropriate and potentially damaging to a promising young officer's career." By the end of 2 weeks, I had assembled a comprehensive file. Service records, performance evaluations, security clearance documentation, financial records, witness statements, and character references. It was a complete picture of a successful military career that had never been interrupted. The final piece was a timeline I created, showing exactly where I had been and what I had been doing during the 3 years of failure my father had described to his friends. During those supposed 3 years of struggle, I had been promoted twice, deployed to 4 countries, and received 3 commendations for exceptional service. I wasn't gathering this evidence to humiliate my father. I was gathering it to reclaim my truth. 2 weeks into my evidence gathering, I received a call that changed everything. General Patricia Coleman's voice was crisp and unmistakably angry when she reached me at my office. "Lieutenant Colonel Hart, I need to see you in my office now." When I arrived, she was standing behind her desk, holding what looked like a printed email. Her expression was thunderous. "Sit down, Evelyn. We need to talk." I had never seen General Coleman this furious. She had been my mentor for 8 years, the woman who had taken a chance on me when my father was trying to sabotage my career. Her respect meant everything to me. "I just received a very interesting phone call," she began, her voice tight with controlled rage. "Apparently, there's been some chatter in the officer community about your family situation. Someone forwarded me an email thread discussing your father's retirement ceremony and his comments about your supposed military failure." My stomach dropped. "Ma'am, I can explain." She held up her hand. "Let me finish. Do you have any idea how this makes me look? How it makes my entire unit look? I have spent 8 years watching you excel at the highest levels of military service. You've completed missions that would break most officers. You've handled classified operations with more skill and dedication than officers twice your age." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "And while you've been serving your country with distinction, your father has been telling the entire military community that you're a failure who couldn't hack it. Do you understand what that does to every classified service member who can't discuss their work?" I hadn't considered that angle. "Ma'am, I never intended." Your father isn't just dishonoring you, Lieutenant Colonel. He's dishonoring every man and woman who serves in the shadows. He's perpetuating the idea that if people can't see your service, it doesn't count. She sat down heavily in her chair. 8 years ago, I told you that this work would require sacrifice. I told you that your family wouldn't understand. But I never imagined your own father would actively work to destroy your reputation while you were risking your life for this country. At that moment, Captain David Chun knocked on the door. General Coleman had called him in as well. His face was grim as he entered. Captain Chun has been working with you for 3 years, General Coleman continued. Tell her what you told me. Chun looked directly at me. Ma'am, what your father is doing is beyond inappropriate. It's damaging to military morale and insulting to every service member in classified operations. I've seen officers break under pressure that wouldn't faze you. I've watched you handle situations that would terrify most people. The fact that your own father is spreading lies about your service record is frankly disgusting. General Coleman nodded. We've decided that this situation needs to be corrected. Your father's behavior isn't just a family matter anymore. It's a professional issue that reflects on all of us. What are you suggesting, ma'am? We're suggesting it's time your father learned exactly who his daughter really is. 3 weeks later, I stood in the same venue where my father's retirement ceremony had taken place. The Fort Richardson Officers Club looked identical, same red, white, and blue bunting, same stage, same elegant setup. But this time I was the one being honored. The plan had been General Coleman's idea, but I had refined the execution. Instead of a direct confrontation that might seem petty or vindictive, we would let the truth speak for itself in the most official way possible. I had sent formal military invitations to everyone who had attended my father's retirement ceremony. The invitations were printed on official Department of Defense letterhead in red. You are cordially invited to attend a promotion ceremony honoring Lieutenant Colonel Evelyn M. Hart. The date, time, and location were clearly stated, but the specific nature of the promotion was not. My father called me 2 days after receiving his invitation. Evelyn, sweetheart, I got your invitation. What's this about? Some kind of civilian award ceremony. It's a military ceremony, Dad. I'd appreciate it if you and Mom could attend. Military? But honey, you're not in the military anymore. Are they giving you some kind of veteran recognition? I kept my voice neutral. You'll understand everything when you get there. My mother was equally confused when she called. Evelyn, your father is wondering if this is some kind of therapy program recognition. You know, for veterans who are struggling with transition issues. Even my brother Marcus seemed puzzled. Ev, what's going on? Dad seems to think this is some kind of support group thing, but the invitation looks pretty official. Just come, Marcus. Everything will make sense. The morning of the ceremony, I arrived early to oversee the final preparations. General Coleman was already there, resplendent in her dress uniform, along with a dozen other high-ranking officers I had worked with over the years. The guest list read like a who's who of military intelligence and special operations. At exactly 1,400 hours, my family walked into the club. I watched from the staging area as they took in the scene. My father's expression shifted from confusion to growing alarm as he recognized the caliber of officers in attendance. These weren't the kind of people who showed up for civilian recognition ceremonies. Colonel Sarah Martinez, now a general herself, was there. Major General Patricia Wells, who had offered me condolences at my father's retirement party, was in the front row. Admiral Richardson, who oversaw naval intelligence, had flown in from Norfolk. These were serious military leaders, not therapists or social workers. My mother whispered something to my father, and I saw him shake his head, clearly struggling to understand what was happening. Marcus looked around the room with growing awareness, his eyes widening as he began to piece together the truth. At exactly 1,430 hours, General Coleman took the stage. The room fell silent as she approached the podium, her expression formal and commanding. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and honored family members, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. We are gathered today to recognize exceptional service to our nation and to correct a significant misunderstanding. I saw my father stiffen in his seat. It is my distinct honor to announce the promotion of Lieutenant Colonel Evelyn Marie Hart to the rank of Brigadier General, effective immediately. The room erupted in applause, but I was watching my family. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Marcus straightened in his chair, his face a mixture of shock and dawning understanding. And my father? My father went completely pale, his confident posture crumbling as the reality hit him. His daughter hadn't failed in the military. She had just been promoted to a rank he had never achieved. General Coleman continued her announcement, her voice carrying the weight of military authority. Brigadier General Hart has served with distinction in classified operations for 8 years. Her service record includes multiple deployments to high-risk theaters, exceptional performance ratings, and commendations for valor under fire. I watched the ripple effect spread through the audience. Officers who had heard my father's dismissive comments about me were visibly stunned. Colonel Thompson, who had told people I'd had a breakdown, was staring at the program in his hands as if it might explain how he'd gotten everything so wrong. General Hart's rapid promotion is a testament to her exceptional leadership, strategic thinking, and unwavering dedication to national security, General Coleman continued. She is the youngest officer in her division to achieve this rank, and her classified work has directly contributed to several successful operations that I cannot detail for obvious security reasons. The whispers started immediately. I could see heads turning, people leaning toward each other, the collective realization that they had been fundamentally misled. Major General Wells, who had offered me condolences for not living up to the family tradition just months earlier, looked mortified. After the formal announcement, the receiving line began. This was where the real reckoning happened. Colonel Rodriguez approached first, his wife Martha trailing behind him with obvious embarrassment. "General Hart," he said, and I noticed how he emphasized my rank. "I owe you an apology. I had been led to believe. Well, I was clearly misinformed about your service record." "Thank you, Colonel. No apology necessary." My response was gracious but formal. Martha looked like she wanted to disappear. "I'm so sorry, Evelyn. When I expressed sympathy for your struggles, I had no idea you were serving at such a high level." The pattern repeated throughout the evening. Officer after officer approached me with varying degrees of embarrassment and confusion. Some were angry at being misled. Others seemed genuinely bewildered about how they had gotten the story so wrong. Admiral Richardson, who had flown in specifically for the ceremony, made a point of speaking loudly enough for nearby groups to hear. "General Hart, your work in the Pacific Theater was exemplary. The intelligence you provided was instrumental in preventing what could have been a significant international incident." The most devastating moment came when General Morrison, my father's former commanding officer, approached the receiving line. He looked directly at my father, who was standing stiffly nearby, and said in a voice that carried, "James, I have to ask, where exactly did you get your information about your daughter's military service?" My father's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Around him, I could see his former colleagues waiting for an answer. These were people who had trusted his judgment, who had believed his stories, who had treated his word as gospel for decades. I was told she had left the service," he finally managed. "Told by whom?" General Morrison pressed. "Because according to this ceremony, she's been continuously serving for 8 years." The silence that followed was deafening. In that moment, everyone in the room understood that my father hadn't just been mistaken, he had been actively spreading false information about a serving officer's record. In military culture, that was tantamount to spreading malicious rumors about a fellow service member. Word spread quickly beyond the ceremony. Within 48 hours, the story had reached every military installation where my father had connections. Phone calls were made, emails forwarded, and conversations held. The narrative shifted completely, from sympathy for a failed daughter to questions about why a respected colonel had been lying about his child's military service for years. The week following my promotion ceremony brought a series of moments that redefined every relationship in my family. The most striking was when I attended my first Pentagon briefing as a Brigadier General, and the seating chart placed me at the head table with other senior officers. My nameplate read, "B. Hart," a rank my father had never achieved in his 30-year career. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew our family history. I was now authorized to attend meetings my father had never been cleared for, make decisions at levels he had never reached, and command resources he had never controlled. The daughter he had dismissed as too soft for military life was now outranking him by 2 full grades. But the real power shift happened in smaller, more personal moments. When my father called me 3 days after the ceremony, his voice was different, uncertain, almost deferential. "Evelyn, we need to talk. There are things I clearly didn't understand. I'm available Sunday afternoon, Dad. We can meet at the base coffee shop." When he arrived, he was wearing his dress uniform, something he had never done for our civilian meetings. It was a subconscious acknowledgement of my new status, a recognition that this was now a meeting between 2 military officers, not just father and daughter. "I don't understand how this happened," he began. His usual commanding presence noticeably diminished. "How did I not know you were still serving? How did I get everything so wrong?" I looked at him across the table. This man who had shaped so much of my early life through his dismissals and limitations. "You got it wrong because you never asked, Dad. You assumed, you decided, and you told everyone your version without ever checking if it was true. But you never corrected me. You let me believe you had left the military. I couldn't discuss my work. When you filled that silence with your own narrative, I had to choose between protecting national security and protecting your feelings. I chose national security." The weight of that statement settled between us. For the first time in my life, my father was the one who needed something from me: understanding, forgiveness, explanation. The dynamic had completely reversed. "The other officers," he said quietly, "they're asking questions about my credibility, about what else I might have gotten wrong." I nodded. That's the consequence of spreading false information about a fellow service member. In our community, integrity is everything. He flinched at the phrase fellow service member. I wasn't his little girl anymore, I was his superior officer. "What do I do now?" he asked. For the first time in our relationship, my father was asking me for guidance. The power had shifted completely, and we both knew it would never shift back. Standing in my new office at the Pentagon, surrounded by commendations I could finally display publicly, I realized that my story had fundamentally changed. The brass nameplate on my desk read, Brigadier General Evelyn M. Hart, not Colonel Hart's daughter, or the one who couldn't make it in the military. For the first time in 8 years, my identity was entirely my own. The transformation began immediately after the promotion ceremony. Within a week, I received invitations to speak at 3 military academies. The requests all had similar themes. They wanted me to address the unique challenges faced by service members in classified roles, particularly women who couldn't discuss their achievements with their families. My first speaking engagement was at West Point, where I stood before 200 cadets in the same auditorium where my father had given a guest lecture 5 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me, or on the academy staff who remembered both events. "How many of you," I began, "have family members who don't understand your military aspirations, who think you're not cut out for service, who believe military leadership is somehow incompatible with who you are?" About half the hands in the room went up. The female cadets were particularly responsive. "I want to tell you about the 8 years when my own family believed I was a failure. Not because I had failed, but because I was succeeding in ways they couldn't see or understand." I talked about the isolation of classified service, the sacrifice of letting people believe false narratives about your life, and the strength required to serve without recognition. The cadets listened with an intensity one hadn't expected. During the question period, one young woman asked, "General Hart, how do you deal with family members who dismiss your capabilities? You prove them wrong through excellence, not arguments. You serve with such distinction that eventually the truth becomes undeniable. And you remember that their opinion of you doesn't change who you are or what you've accomplished." The response was overwhelming. Within days, I was fielding requests from military installations across the country. My story had resonated beyond just the classified community. It spoke to anyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or written off by people who claimed to know them best. At Fort Benning, I spoke to a group of female special operations candidates. Some of you will face family members who tell you this work isn't appropriate for women. Some of you will have fathers, brothers, or mentors who try to steer you towards safer roles. Remember that their limitations are not your limitations. The media attention was unexpected but powerful. Military publications featured articles about the general who served in secret, and breaking barriers in classified operations. The coverage focused not on my family drama, but on the broader issue of unrecognized service and the challenges faced by women in high-level military roles. I established the Hart Foundation for Classified Service Recognition, a scholarship fund for dependents of service members whose work couldn't be publicly acknowledged. The foundation's mission statement read, "Honoring those who serve in the shadows and supporting the families who sacrifice alongside them." But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from my peers. General Coleman recommended me for the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, citing my exceptional leadership in classified operations and significant contribution to national security. The citation would be public record, a permanent acknowledgement of my service that no one could dispute or diminish. At the award ceremony, as I stood at attention while the medal was pinned to my uniform, I thought about the young lieutenant who had been told she wasn't built for military service. That woman had become a general not despite the obstacles placed in her path, but because overcoming them had made her stronger, more determined, and more capable of leading others who faced similar challenges. My legacy was no longer tied to my father's approval or disapproval. It was written in the lives of the service members I mentored, the operations I had led, and the barriers I had broken. I wasn't Colonel Hart's daughter who had failed to live up to expectations. I was General Hart, who had exceeded every expectation anyone had ever set for her. In the months following the ceremony, I could have destroyed my father's reputation completely. I had documented evidence of his lies, witness statements from officers he had misled, and the moral authority that came with my new rank. The military community was already questioning his integrity. A few well-placed words from me could have ended any respect he had left, but I chose a different path. Sir, justice would be if I had actually failed and needed revenge. But I didn't fail. I succeeded beyond anything he thought possible. His embarrassment isn't my victory. My promotion is my victory. The most telling moment came when General Coleman asked if I wanted to pursue any formal action against my father for spreading false information about a serving officer. Ma'am, the best revenge against someone who said you couldn't succeed is succeeding so completely that their opinion becomes irrelevant. I don't need him to be punished. I need him to be irrelevant to my story. And that's exactly what happened. I simply moved forward, building my career and reputation on my own merits, while my father dealt with the consequences of his choices. I didn't need revenge because I had something better. I had the truth, and the truth had set me free. 6 months after my promotion ceremony, I sat in my Pentagon office with a simple package addressed to my father. Inside was a single item, a framed 8x10 photograph of me in my Brigadier General dress uniform, taken during my official promotion portrait session. At the bottom, in crisp black ink, I had written, "With respect for your service, Brigadier General Evelyn M. Hart." No letter, no explanation, no emotional plea or accusation, just a photograph and a signature that said everything that needed to be said. I had considered dozens of approaches for this moment. I could have written a long letter detailing how his lies had affected me. I could have included copies of my service record to prove my accomplishments. I could have demanded an explanation or an apology. But all of those approaches would have required him to respond, to engage, to continue the drama. This photograph required nothing from him except acknowledgement. I mailed it on a Tuesday morning and went about my duties. 3 days later, my mother called. "Evelyn, your father received your package." Her voice was careful, measured. He hung the photograph on the wall in his study, right next to his own promotion pictures. I said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "He stares at it sometimes, just stands there looking at it. I think he's trying to understand how he missed so much." "Mom, there's nothing to understand. It is what it is. He wants to call you to thank you for the picture, but he doesn't know what to say." "Then maybe he shouldn't say anything." That evening, Marcus texted me a photo. It showed my father's study wall, a gallery of military portraits spanning 3 generations of Hart family service. There was my grandfather in his World War II uniform, my father in his various ranks from lieutenant through colonel, Marcus in his captain's dress blues, and now me in my general's stars. The composition was perfect, the progression clear. I hadn't broken the family military tradition, I had elevated it. But the most powerful part wasn't what the photograph said about me. It was what it forced my father to confront every time he entered his study. There, looking back at him from his own wall, was undeniable proof that his daughter had achieved something he never had. Not through rebellion or spite, but through the same values he claimed to cherish: duty, honor, service to country. The photograph became a daily reminder that his version of my story had been fiction. Every time he sat at his desk to write emails or make phone calls, he faced the truth. Every time a colleague visited his home and saw that wall of military portraits, they would ask about his daughter, the general. And every time, he would have to acknowledge that she had surpassed him. I never followed up on the gift. I never asked if he received it or what he thought about it. The photograph was my period at the end of a very long sentence, my final word on 8 years of lies and dismissal. The silence that followed was more powerful than any confrontation could have been. It was closure without drama, finality without cruelty, and truth without the need for explanation. Sometimes the most profound statements are made not with words, but with simple, undeniable facts. My father never called to thank me for the photograph. He never wrote a letter explaining his mistakes or expressing regret for the years of lies. But his behavior began to change in ways that spoke louder than any apology could have. The first sign came during a family barbecue at Marcus's house 3 months after I sent the photograph. I arrived to find my father sitting on the back porch, scrolling through his phone with unusual intensity. When my cousin Rebecca asked about his children, I expected the familiar dance of deflection and dismissal. Instead, I heard something I had never heard before. Well, Marcus is doing great with the 82nd Airborne. Just made Major, and we're very proud of him. A pause. And Evelyn is a Brigadier General now. Can't really discuss her work. You know how it is with classified operations, but she's doing exceptionally well. I stopped arranging the salad I was carrying and listened more carefully. A general? Rebecca's voice carried surprise and admiration. James, that's incredible. You must be so proud. We are. Very proud. The words sounded strange coming from him, like he was testing out a new language. She's accomplished things things that go far beyond anything I achieved in my career. It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. He was publicly claiming pride in accomplishments he had spent years denying existed. The transformation became more apparent over the following months. At military events where my father was still occasionally invited, attendees began mentioning my promotion. Rather than the uncomfortable deflections I expected, he started carrying himself differently, almost as if my success reflected well on him. Colonel Martinez, now a general herself, told me about an encounter at a military wives' luncheon. Your father was there as a guest speaker, and someone asked about military families. He spent 10 minutes talking about the sacrifices parents make when their children serve in classified roles. He said, "You have to trust that you raised them right and that they're serving with honor, even when you can't see the results of their work." My mother's transformation was even more dramatic. At her book club, her bridge games, her church gatherings, she began mentioning her daughter, the general, with a frequency that bordered on bragging. Mrs. Patterson, one of her longtime friends, mentioned to me at the grocery store how much my mother talked about my military career. "She shows everyone that photograph you sent your father," Mrs. Patterson said with a smile. "She's just so proud. She says she always knew you were destined for great things. Always knew." The revision of history was breathtaking in its completeness, but I found I didn't care about the inconsistency. The lie that I had failed was being replaced with a new narrative, that they had always believed in me. It wasn't true, but it was better. The most telling moment came during Marcus's promotion ceremony to lieutenant colonel. As family members were introduced, the officer conducting the ceremony mentioned that Lieutenant Colonel Hart came from a distinguished military family, and specifically noted that his sister was Brigadier General Evelyn Hart, currently serving in classified operations. I watched my father's face during that introduction. There was no discomfort, no embarrassment, no attempt to qualify or diminish my achievements. Instead, he straightened in his chair with something that looked remarkably like pride. After the ceremony, multiple officers approached him with congratulations. "You must be Colonel Hart, the general's father. What an accomplished family you have." He accepted these comments graciously, as if he had always been proud of both his children equally. He never said, "I'm sorry." He never admitted he had been wrong. But he stopped telling the old story and started living in the new reality where his daughter was exactly who she had always been. A successful military officer who had earned her rank through merit and dedication. Sometimes recognition is more valuable than apology, and respect is more meaningful than regret. 2 years after my promotion, I stood in the conference room of the Hart Center for Military Leadership Excellence, watching young officers participate in a leadership workshop I had designed. The center, established with my own funds and housed on a military installation in Virginia, had become everything I had envisioned, a place where rising military leaders could develop skills without the limitations that others might try to impose on them. The irony of the name wasn't lost on me. The Hart Center bore my family name, but it represented values that transcended the narrow vision my father had once tried to impose. Here, young women learned advanced tactical planning. Officers from diverse backgrounds studied unconventional warfare. The motto etched in granite at the entrance read, "Excellence has no limitations." Captain Sarachan, one of our scholarship recipients, approached me after the session. "General Hart, I wanted to thank you. 6 months ago, my commanding officer told me I wasn't suited for special operations because I was too analytical. Your mentorship program helped me understand that analytical thinking is exactly what special operations needs." I smiled, remembering my own father's assessment that I was too soft for demanding military roles. Captain Chun, never let someone else's limitations become your ceiling. Their inability to see your potential doesn't diminish your potential. My office walls told the story of my transformed identity. Gone were the hidden commendations and classified achievements. In their place hung photos from speaking engagements at military academies, certificates from the Hart Foundation scholarship recipients, and letters from young officers whose careers had been shaped by my mentorship programs. The most meaningful addition was a framed letter from the Secretary of Defense, recommending me for promotion to Major General. The letter specifically cited my innovative approach to leadership development and exceptional contribution to military education reform. My next promotion wouldn't be about proving my father wrong, it would be about the positive impact I was having on the next generation of military leaders. My personal life had transformed as well. I was no longer defined by what my family thought of me or constrained by their expectations. I had built relationships with people who knew me as General Hart first, not as Colonel Hart's daughter. My identity was entirely my own creation. The final validation came during a Pentagon briefing on military education reform. As I presented my recommendations to a room full of senior officers, I realized that no one in that room was thinking about my family dynamics or my father's former opinions. They were listening to me because of my expertise, my track record, and my vision for the future. After the briefing, as I walked through the Pentagon corridors past portraits of military leaders throughout history, I understood that my story had become something much larger than a family conflict. It had become proof that strength doesn't always announce itself loudly, that excellence doesn't require permission, and that sometimes the most powerful victory is simply becoming so successful that other people's opinions become irrelevant. I had built a legacy that belonged entirely to me. The greatest victory isn't proving your enemies wrong. It's becoming so successful that their opinion of you becomes completely irrelevant.